Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
What is it about human beings that fill them with such a prevalent belief in God? In an era filled with instant information and rapidly advancing technology, how is it that so many place their strongest beliefs in a millennia-old God whom they can neither see, nor hear, nor touch? The question before us tonight, friends, is why do so many people believe in God? My name is Kate Bankson, and I'd like to welcome you tonight to the Veritas Forum at Yale. As Yale students, we know all about Veritas. It is, after all, half of who we are as Yaleys. We concern ourselves with lux et veritas, light and truth. Tonight, in our focus on this Veritas, we're here for a real discussion, connecting truth to our hardest questions and our deepest beliefs. Tonight's event is not a debate. We're not here to see people win or lose or score points off each other. We're here to converse and discuss, to ponder and to posit. We have asked our presenters to share their work and their discoveries, ask honest and thoughtful questions of one another, and model a conversation that all of us can continue this evening and beyond. Our hope is that everyone in this room would be challenged. For those of you here who identify as Christians, we hope you will be challenged by both our presenters to examine your faith with intellectual honesty and rigor. For those of you who think of the Christian faith as mystifying, irrelevant, or disproved, we hope you will be challenged by hearing from a Christian intellectual who can make a serious case for why faith in Jesus makes sense to him.
I would like to start the discussion by allowing each of the panelists to take a few minutes to describe their research in broad terms. What are the kinds of things that they work on? And then we'll begin to talk about how it's relevant in particular to the topic at hand. So perhaps, Justin, you'd start first.
Sure, thanks so much for being here tonight instead of watching March Madness or whatever else you might be doing. It's a real pleasure to spend this time with you and with Paul, whose work I've admired quite a bit. I generally work, I guess, on the scientific study of religion broadly, particularly psychological perspectives. I typically take a developmental approach. So I look at how children's minds develop such that it makes them receptive to certain kinds of ideas, certain types of practices we call religious. I also do a little bit of work on other areas that apply the cognitive sciences to cultural expression, like cognition and art, another area of overlapping interest that we have. And especially in connection with my new position, I'm starting to look more at both childhood and adolescent character and virtue development, as well as other areas of human thriving and flourishing. That I can't tell you much about. It's still new to me, but hopefully I'll be learning fast. Is that the kind of level?
Good, great. Professor Bloom?
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the Veritas Forum and the many sponsors for setting this up and for all of you to be here. I'm really grateful to be up here with Justin Barrett. He has a Yale connection. He's one of the star graduate students of Frank Kyle, who's over there, and who's my colleague in psychology and a master of Morse College. I'm also really glad to have him up here because he's one of the founders and most influential figures in the cognitive science of religion. He's done hugely important work, and I actually have a physical copy of his newest book. My own research cuts across different areas, including I'm finishing off a book on the origin of morality, a topic which does connect with religion in interesting ways, and maybe we could turn to that later. But I've long been interested in religion, and religion, as we know, breaks up into different parts. You can talk about religious practice, religious community, but I'm mostly interested, as is Justin, in religious belief. And I'm interested in the prevalence of certain sorts of beliefs that appear to be universal or near universal, such as a belief in divine beings like gods and spirits and angels, a belief in special creation, that humans and other animals are the product of the intentional workings of divine being, and beliefs such as life after death. And there's a lot of controversy over where these beliefs come from. One dominant view is that they're the products of culture, cultural inventions. Another view is that they're biological adaptations. But there's a view, which actually Justin, I think, is the strongest supporter of, which I endorse, which is that from an evolutionary point of view, religious belief is an accident. That is, we didn't specially evolve to have these beliefs. Rather, they emerge out of more general habits of the mind, such as a general animism to see intentional agency in the movements of things around us, a mind-body dualism where it's natural for us to think of physical minds as separate from physical bodies, and a general propensity to apply teleological or intentional explanation, looking for purposes and causes out in the world. And together, I think these conspire to create religious beliefs, and that's one aspect of my work. A second aspect of my work looks regarding religion, looks at religious differences. So, although many people believe in supernatural beings, the sort of supernatural being you believe in varies. In some cultures, you might believe in Christ or Muhammad or Zeus, and you might believe in a multiplicity of such beings. Although most cultures believe in life after death, you might have different notions. Is it reincarnation? Is there a heaven or a hell? Are there ancestor spirits? And so there's a huge learning problem. As a developmental psychologist, in order to explain the full scope of religion and religious beliefs, you have to see it not in terms merely of innate propensities, but also in terms of capacities for learning. And I think the story of how religious ideas are learned is also an extremely interesting one. I'll end by just mentioning something briefly that speaks to the theme, to some of the themes of the introductions, and I think we'll probably go back and forth on a little bit, which is many people see a sinister agenda in the sort of research we'll be talking today, that somehow to talk about the neuroscience and psychology and evolution of religious beliefs is fundamentally an attack on religion. From the Veritas website, I read what we're going to be talking about is God real? Or can evolutionary psychology provide an alternative explanation? And I want to suggest that there's not a real contrast here. And here again, I'm sure there'll be areas of disagreement, but this isn't one of them. There's a difference between the question of whether there exists gods or ghosts or germs, and the question of why it is we believe in gods or ghosts or germs. And more specifically, regardless of whether or not religious belief is true, we need a theory as to why people possess it. Moreover, there's no sense in which these evolutionary explanations can refute or are problematic for the idea of an omniscient and omnipotent God, because nothing could refute such an idea. No matter how it is we come to have religious beliefs, it's possible if one believes in an all-powerful deity, they can say, this is how he chose to put it in us. If Freud was right and we believe in God because we're searching for a father figure, I think it's a terrible theory. But imagine for the moment it was right. It turned out to be just factually true. A theist could say, well, that's how God chose to put it in our heads. And I don't think the broader question of evolution or neuroscience is in any way a challenge to particular theistic beliefs. I think more interestingly, though, many theists come out with specific theories as to why we believe in God, and these can be turned out to be true or false based on the sort of research we'll be discussing. If one argued that there's a special faculty for faith or an innate propensity to believe in God, I think we can then talk about it and see whether or not these claims are true or false. And so a lot of the particulars, which turn out to be very interesting, I hope we'll be getting to tonight.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now, two of the books that you've one each have written are interesting to me, and I had a chance to look at them only briefly on my Kindle. But is your book Born Believers, and your book Descartes' Baby. And as a philosopher, the title Descartes makes me instantly want to read the book, so I enjoyed that. But I wonder if you couldn't summarize the findings that led to your writing Born Believers. What is the thesis in that book? And then we'll turn to Paul and have him summarize Descartes' Baby.
Sure, yeah. In some ways, Paul's already done a really good job of summarizing a lot of the impetus, so maybe we can just go home now. My Born Believers thesis is this, that, at least in part, the widespread cross-cultural recurrence in belief in some kind of God is at least partly accountable in terms of the natural receptivity that we have to such beliefs in early childhood, maybe even in infancy to some degree. That is, children, I'm going to be a little bit, I hedge my bets how much of it is sort of just hardwired, I avoid that term, or innate, I avoid that term. But whether it's because of some kind of biological endowment or biological endowment plus certain regularities of the environment that children are typically born into, they develop a natural propensity toward to being receptive to certain kinds of religious beliefs. Okay, well, that's probably bland enough. So by born believers, I mean children are given very minimal kinds of cultural conditions, very little kinds of resources. They will take to religious beliefs like ducks to water. Okay? So I have in mind the kind of idea of, my mom always said that, the doctor said that my brother was a born basketball player. Well, the doctor was wrong about that, it turns out. But the idea wasn't that, he comes out of the birth canal shooting a jump shot, but rather that given very sort of minimal kinds of encouragement, he's going to take to it. All right? And so we use that kind of loose language, and that's what I mean by born believers. Don't get too excited there. I am not advocating that children come out of the womb with a full-fledged theological concept of any God you choose. Of course, that's not right. Okay? But they do have strong receptivity. Why do I think that? Or what do I think some of the faculties are that are involved? And I am going to use the word faculties in this case because I don't think it's the case that we have one dedicated adaptation that somehow makes you religious. Right? Once upon a time, there was a genetic mutation that led to a certain kind of cognitive faculty, and boom, that's why people believe in gods. I think rather it's the case that what we have is, I don't know, think of lots of pieces in an orchestra that collectively encourage or make us receptive to certain kinds of religious concepts. And Paul has already hinted at some of these. One important one is a strong tendency